Hi, everyone. My name is Marta Tufet, and I'm the Executive Director at the UK Collaborative on Development Research, or UKCDR. And it's my real pleasure to welcome everyone today at the UKCDR virtual dialogue on supporting the COP26 priorities through research on international development. We have received over 250 registrations, and it's fantastic to see a range of participants, from researchers to policymakers, to participants from different sectors, from the philanthropic sector, the public sector, the private sector, which really just shows the importance of the topic in question. So for those of you who don't know us, UKCDR is a collaborative of major UK research funders working in international development. And our mission is really to amplify the value and impact of research for global development by promoting coherence, collaboration, and joint action among UK research funders. And so for over a decade, we have been bringing these research funders together to discuss priorities, to identify gaps and opportunities, and to importantly coordinate them to garner maximum impact from their collective investments. And also importantly, to support the case to make continued investments in research for international development. So today's event really aims to showcase some of these impacts from these investments, and to really share the learning around research to achieve the priorities which have been set for the UN Climate Change Conference, the COP26. We are also trialing for the first time an opportunity to engage in further discussion after the event through a networking session. And this is listening to feedback from participants of our other events, and also recognizing that we need to really create more of these opportunities given the ways in which we are currently working. So before I explain a little bit more about the event and why the subject is important to us at UKCDR, I'm going to take a few minutes to run through a few housekeeping points. So as this is a Blue Jeans live event, you will only be able to ask questions through the Q&A function, which is located at the top right of the screen. And once questions are asked, you can upvote the questions by pressing the like button on the questions. And we will pick the questions which are most upvoted. And to ask a question, please include your name and organization in the question box so we know who it's coming from. That's always nice for the presenters. And if it's highlighted to someone, do tell us. You won't be able to see the other participants at the event. You'll only be able to see the presenters. But as I've mentioned, there's an opportunity at the networking session to continue the Q&A. And at that session, you will be able to see other participants who have joined. So we will be sending a link to the session in the chat function as well, so that you have it accessible. So we have also produced a booklet for the event, which is available on our website and will be circulated to all attendees. And this booklet also showcases a wider range of projects that we have been able to include in today's event. We received a lot of interest, and unfortunately we can't fit everything in the short time that we have, but I would encourage everyone to look at that booklet, as there's some really interesting projects there as well. And finally, just to say that the meeting is going to be recorded, so that you have access to this after the meeting, and it can be shared with colleagues, or you can reference it at a later time. Right, so with those housekeeping pointings aside, I'd like now to give a short introduction to the topic of the webinar and why it's important to us at UKCDR. So today we really want to explore and celebrate the role of research on climate change and international development in supporting the COP26 priorities and in achieving the terms of the Paris Agreement and the UN global goals more broadly. So the COP26 priorities of adaptation, resilience, nature, energy transition, clean road transport, and finance present both unique challenges and opportunities in the context of low and middle income countries. The World Bank has already calculated that without climate-informed development, up to 100 million additional people could be forced into poverty by 2030, which is really alarming. And as we know, poor and marginalized populations, small island developing states, and low-income countries are going to be among the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. But also, without innovation, developing countries are increasingly likely to also contribute to climate change as they experience population increase, urbanization, and economic growth. If you look at Africa, it is projected that by 2050, 60% of the population will be urban in comparison to just 10% in the 1950s. So research is really critically important to identifying how to achieve the conditions under which the climate goals can be achieved alongside the development goals, and so that we are designing strategies that maximize those synergies and minimize the trade-offs between the two. And that's why it's important that funders with complementary skills talk together about these issues and how they can maximize on each other's strengths and weaknesses. Research on climate change and international developments is already doing a lot to achieve real-world impacts, ranging from shaping policy and practice, building knowledge, to generating new engagement, new relationships, and strengthening capacity. And we really look forward to sharing the examples of some of these impacts in our webinar today. And as I've mentioned, we've produced this booklet, which really showcases an even wider range of products whose impacts map directly onto the COP26. And I believe one of my colleagues is going to post a link in the chat so you have direct access to that booklet as well. So it's in particular important at present for us to recognize the outstanding contributions that research is making. With just a year to go before UK hosts COP26, we want to recognize the contribution of the international development research community towards timely action on climate mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and climate science. And with budgets and people under additional strain due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we really need to remember the value of research in delivering impacts, and importantly, in amplifying the value of other spend on development and climate, and in targeting action where it is most needed. And we need to celebrate these successes when we see them. And so we are really delighted at UKCDR to have the opportunity to present this showcase event and the accompanying booklet. And we really hope that it will lead to further conversations over the coming year about how international development research can support global climate goals and the COP26 priorities specifically. So we are also, in addition to this event, we are also delivering a larger project to map and analyze the scope and the reach of UK international development research on climate change, which we will be publishing early next year. And we hope that that report, which will be public, will help funders and researchers and other practitioners alike to take stock and understand where the remaining gaps are, where the opportunities. Right, so with that introduction, I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, who is going to help set the scene for the presentations which are to follow. So I'm going to invite Mark Pelling to give us an overview of the science and research landscape in the context of COP26. Mark is a GCRF Challenge Lead for Resilience, as well as the chair of UKCDR's own Disasters Research Funders Group. And importantly, he has also served as coordinating lead author for the IPCC 6 assessment report and the special report on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. And he was also the lead author on the 5th IPCC assessment report. So we're really delighted to have him opening the dialogue. So welcome, Mark, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'll be talking to some PowerPoint slides, which fantastic, there they are. First of all, as well as thanking you, let me just recognize what a daunting task you've kindly sent me in 10 minutes to talk to the role of research in supporting COP26 priorities. And this is daunting mainly because of the huge quality of research that one could talk to, both in terms of the substantial breadth of that research, the quality, as I've already mentioned, but also its tangible impact, which is perhaps the most difficult task that faces researchers today. And that impact in low and middle income countries in particular. The quality and strength of that research, I think, is testament to the journey that researchers have undertaken worldwide, but certainly the UK has been, I think, a leading part of this, around increasingly researching through equitable partnerships and relationships. And this is true, I think, across the whole set of domains of science that are in front of us today. So the climate science and climate services, the impact and adaptation science and research, and the mitigation and low carbon development research. A huge volume of high quality work. I'm also aware that today we have a mixed audience, an audience of researchers, policymakers and practitioners. So I hope that I'll be able to say something that touches on all of your interests. You can see the agenda that I want to talk to there on the screen. If I could have the next slide, please. What I want to start off with is just to indicate to those of you that perhaps are not aware of the background organising within the UK government, that there is indeed a substantial role, formal role, for science in the shaping of the COP as an event. And this is a simple organisational diagram to demonstrate some of those links. I won't spend a great deal of time on it, but I think it's also always useful to have these things presented, particularly to the researchers and overseas policy actors here. The Cabinet Office is driving the COP. Embedded within that is a cross-Whitehall group on science, which has bays, as well as specific research-focused entities like the Met Office, Department for Transport, DEFRA, the Government Office for Science, and what was DFID FCO, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, as it now is. So straight away you see the breadth of interests, technical fields, policy fields from across government that are able to bring together a range of research. UKRI, the United Kingdom Research and Innovation, is part of that conversation and is a link into the coalface, if you like, of knowledge generation. Here we see an example of that through the Grantham COP26 UK Universities Group. So this is just a formal organisation. Of course, there are all sorts of independent, bilateral and multiple arrangements that individual researchers, research projects are also trying to orient towards COP26. So I'm not trying to capture that full breadth, just to show you there are these lines of formal collaboration. If I could have the next slide, please. This is to show you, if you haven't already been aware, of the 5 thematics that COP26 is organised around its policy priorities. I'll let you read the detail, but it's just to show you these headline titles, that there is an interest in adaptation and resilience, and particularly equity within that, and a reach through to funding, an emphasis on nature, so protecting and restoring natural habitats and ecosystems, both as part of adaptation but also part of mitigation, energy and transition to clean energy through the use of renewables, and innovations in things like energy storage is key. Transport, of course, particular connection point between development and mitigation, and finance. Finance, both around a green transformation of financial systems, but also an interest in the availability of financing across geographies. So that's kind of scene setting. And now what I'd like to do is paint a very high level picture of the kind of science that we might be seeing in the COP and the run up to the COP, and indeed today. So if we could have the next slide, please. This is the most established relationship between science and research and policy practice. Science and research providing the evidence base for policy, and increasingly in a co-produced effort. Now though, and I think we'll see that very much today, there are a whole range of ways in which this relationship has grown. So if we could have the next slide. In addition to that evidence-based role then, we're also seeing research that is leading in enabling policy change through innovation and uptake. So research that becomes very close to either private sector or government uptake. That research offers a convening space for change through the language of science, particularly when co-produced across different stakeholder groups, perhaps the organised urban poor and urban managers. There's an opportunity for different stakeholders to present their views in a more neutral language of science and enable collaborative movement at the policy or practical levels. So that convening space for science is itself an outcome of research. Capacity strengthening is increasingly embedded within research projects or legacy, so capacity strengthening at levels from the community through, but also within academic institutions in low and middle income countries. And popular outreach, engagement with the public through museums, through the press, and so on. So the role of science and research has matured into at least these 5 different mechanisms of engagement. And I think we'll hear some of those today. If I could have the next slide. So moving on from the sense of transformational impact, the next slide introduces the sense of comprehensive impact. We have those methodologies that I've just described, but of course the methodologies are deployed, and again we'll hear this today, in different ways by different traditions of knowledge creation, and indeed increasingly hybrid, co-produced, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary forms of knowledge production. I won't labour the point, but simply to say that the complex problems that climate change throws at us, particularly I think from a development perspective, where climate change intersects with livelihood, with policy trajectories and pathways, where there are multiple demands and limited resources, it tends to be multidisciplinary projects that help to frame the problem most productively and begin to resolve it. And at the bottom here, you see as well the recognition of local, traditional and experiential knowledge, which increasingly is brought next to more formal science methodologies. Could I have the next slide, please? So that's a degree of diversity or richness, and the SDGs, of course, are really important in providing some focus. Here you can see with the dark boxes the entry points for GCRF across the SDGs, but I think one of the lessons of research over the last few years has been indeed that it's not just to focus on particular SDGs, and of course the GCRF portfolio touches all of them, but to look at the intersections between the SDGs. So how does climate action support poverty alleviation? How does good health connect through to gender equity? So in that sense, the SDGs really, I think, highlight the systemic nature, the ambition for systemic impact. And again, I think we'll see some of that this afternoon. Could I have the next slide, please? I don't want to spend time describing a long list of research outputs from UKRI, but I thought it was helpful perhaps to those of you who are new to UKRI or GCRF, just to have a flavour of some of the research areas and programmes. So this is a very small selection of those, and I'll simply read through it to give you a taste. Perhaps it also positions some of the research excellence we'll hear today in context. So we have a stream of research that helps us to understand how climate is changing. We have a particular strand of research around climate resilience in Africa, associating food security, livelihoods with climatic change and governance. A stream of research around disaster risk reduction in low and middle income countries. Research around ecosystem climate adaptation, and of course research around mitigation and embedded carbon within development pathways. So I hope you can see how some of these topics map on quite nicely to the COP priority areas, though it'll be interesting in discussions to see if you identify gaps indeed. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide to bring together, I hope, some of those reasonably high-level ideas that can help us to map out the research that we'll hear this afternoon. And as Marta said, there is much research behind it. But certainly to hold in our minds that this is research at the interface of climate change and development, so bringing two global challenges together. It's research, I think, that is able to demonstrate research excellence, that is co-produced, that is transformational, comprehensive, and systemic in terms of impact. And a final point to bring us down to the COP itself, and just to recognise there are at least three ways I would like to hope that UKRI and GCRF can enable researchers to engage with COP. First of all, from now to COP with pre-events like this one. At the COP itself, there'll be an exhibition centre and we'll be helping to convene that. And after COP as well, with legacy and momentum events. I think for me, the COP is very much a moment that we can use to help articulate science and then take the energy from the COP to really enhance the way in which the best science is able to inform and facilitate action from community to national and global. So with that, again, a thanks to Marta, Laura and the team, and I will hand you back to Marta, I think. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Mark, for that really thoughtful overview and really forcing us to think beyond the research excellence and thinking about the different pathways to impact. So we now move on to our first of two panels, showcasing a range of research projects and the ways in which they are delivering impacts which contribute to achieving those COP26 priorities. So we will hear from three projects first, and then we will have a short window for Q&A. And so remember to enter and upvote questions into the Q&A comments box. And as I mentioned at the start, we also have an opportunity for further discussions in the networking event. So if we don't have a chance to pick your question, we will do so afterwards. So I'm delighted to introduce our first three panelists. We have Keith Hyams from the University of Warwick. We have Emma Morales and María Ibarrarán and Soledad García Ferrari from Edinburgh and Ed Brown from Loughborough University. So first, I would like to welcome Keith to talk about ethics in adaptation and resilience. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you. Can we start with the next slide, please? So just to give an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about ethics and resilience as it applies to adaptation and resilience and work that we're doing at the University of Warwick with various local communities around these issues. I'll begin by giving you a quick overview of what ethics is and why it matters to adaptation and resilience. And then I'll talk about two projects. The first is with Batwa Indigenous peoples in Uganda. That's funded by the British Academy. The second project I'll talk about is working with the City of Cape Town to think about how in practice to integrate ethics into policy making. Next slide, please. So why is ethics important in the context of adaptation and resilience? Well, there's been work looking at the sort of international level, particularly around mitigation, about the kind of ethical principles that might inform negotiations and burden sharing. There's been almost nothing so far taking a philosophical approach to ethics at the local level and thinking about the kind of principles that ought to guide resilience and adaptation planning at sort of country level and at community level. Some of the issues that we look at are things like fair representation and participation of vulnerable communities and how to ensure procedural justice in making decisions, how to integrate different forms of knowledge, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, scientific knowledge, not just sort of creating mechanisms for doing that, but ensure that it's done in a way that sort of respects epistemic justice norms. And then there's trade-offs between different policy options. For example, where there's limited pots of money, how should you choose what to prioritize and who to prioritize when you have to make those trade-off decisions? And which values, sometimes it comes down to prioritizing where you have sort of different areas you can concentrate on. What responsibilities should different actors have for developing adaptation and resilience at the city level, at the local level, at the country level? And the way that we're doing this research is informed both by philosophical thinking about sort of underlying principles and how to think through our intuitions about these things, but also empirical methods. So we're interested in how injustice plays out in terms of the experience of injustice at the local level and how that relates to what policymakers should be thinking. Next slide, please. First project I want to go into more detail on is working with the Batwa indigenous people in South, a case study of how indigenous peoples more generally are affected by injustice and how that underlies their capacity to adapt to climate change and resilience. This is, as I said, funded by the British Academy International Challenges, and our main findings are summarised in a publication that's cited on that slide, which has just come out online with Climate and Development. Next slide, please. What do we find in this project? Well, we found that resilience and adaptive capacity of the Batwa, in common with indigenous peoples globally, is unavoidably bound up with these issues of ethics and justice. So some of the injustices we found on the ground, there was clearly distributive injustices, so a lack of access and unequal access between communities and within communities to basic needs, things like food, clothing, shelter, education and health. But beyond distributive injustice, there was procedural injustices about how decisions were made. So there was a lack of participation on the Batwa in the design and the implementation of adaptive plans. There was a lack of recognition justice in the sense that indigenous people were not given the same social status and lacked political participation in society more widely, which then fed through into the kind of distributive and procedural injustices that we saw. And there was historic injustice in the sense that clear injustices have been done to the Batwa in the past. So, for example, their displacement to make way for the Bwindi National Park. And there was a complete lack of compensation or any sort of rectification that made it that undercut their capacity in the present to adapt to climate impacts and to focus on resilience. What we found more generally when it came to policy makers and interventions by NGOs was that they tended to focus on one particular type of injustice. Usually that was distributive injustices, meeting basic needs, but there was a lack of a holistic approach to ethics and justice, taking into account all the different dimensions of justice that matter and how they interrelate. And so we made some recommendations around the need for policy to focus not just on one aspect of justice, but to think about how these different aspects of ethics and justice all interrelate and contribute to resilience and adaptation planning. Next slide, please. The second project is an ongoing project with the City of Cape Town, their Climate Change and Environmental Management Department, where we want to understand how, in practice, to embed ethics of issues and justice in actual planning for adaptation and resilience. And how to get policymakers to sort of think through these issues and build them into the planning processes. And we're hoping to develop a pilot with Cape Town, which can then be rolled out more generally. This research is funded by the AHRC through the GCRF programme. Next slide, please. We've begun by mapping out the obstacles that we face, that we're going to try to develop solutions to. And so far we've found obstacles sort of in these four categories. So the technocratic approaches to resilience, which focus on engineering solutions and are beginning to take into account social dimensions of resilience, but still don't really think sufficiently about the values that interact with resilience and adaptation planning. We find a general lack of understanding of values and of ethics, and sometimes a tendency to think, well, everybody's ethical view is equally valid, so what's to be gained by trying to think through general principles to guide policy making. We have departmentally siloed policy making, so different departments handling different aspects of policy, when in reality, in order to embed ethics across the landscape, we need to start thinking in a more joined up way, joining up policy across departments. And there's a lack of coherence between what international aspirations and local reality. For example, sort of statements around rights of indigenous peoples, human rights, and what goes on in the ground. So we're thinking about how to join up international aspirations with the local reality. Next slide, please. And so the solutions, which is a work in progress, working with Cape Town, unfortunately has been put on hold because of the pandemic, but we're hoping to resume this soon. So we're developing workshop methods with the policymakers in Cape Town around scenario building and problem-oriented deliberations to think through the kind of ethical issues that they face in their work and how they might appeal to general principles and think through the issues and ensure that it's embedded at all levels of that planning process. try to overcome the siloization of departmental working by using the key contacts in the adaptation department to reach out to other contacts and bring everybody together and develop new cross-departmental strategies for building ethics into the planning. We're using the ethics framework as a kind of neutral framework where conflicts that would be conflictual between different stakeholders can kind of come together within this framework to work through the conflicts and think in a sort of removed way about the kind of ethics and justice issues that might ground a solution to potential conflicts, with the sort of academic ethics framing as a neutral ground for doing that. And finally, we want to think about how to align international funding streams with processes that can support the local ethical deliberation in order to try and achieve that joined up thinking between the international aspirations and what's going on in the ground. So I'll end there and hand over to the next. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith, for that really important presentation. So secondly, we welcome Emma Morales, María Ibarrarán, and María García Ferrari, who will present together on collaborative solutions to manage adaptation and monitoring climate change in periurban Mexico. So over to you all.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, what we wanted to share was two projects that we're working on that are connected to collaborative solutions to manage adaptation and monitoring climate change in periurban Mexico. The next slide, please. So the first project was about developing collaborative smart city solutions to manage adaptation and monitoring climate change. We worked in the periurban area in Puebla, which is one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the continent. And what we found is that this sort of aggressive urbanization over rural land mainly has brought new levels of vulnerability, not just socially, economically, but also in terms of flooding, droughts, and other issues. So we had two different strategies at the beginning. We had other projects, but the main ones were about workshops of perception of risk. And the second was dialogues of knowledges, where everybody would sort of be on the same level, but we had the opportunity to involve all the different stakeholders. Next, the two projects were, next slide, please. The two projects were Newton Fund, British Council. The first one was an institutional links project, and the second is an impact scheme. And in the first one, the impact that we found, one of the main impacts and what we wanted to show and why we consider that international funding is so fundamental, is that the perception workshops, even before we engaged into this planning of solutions, people already started working in their houses, their streets, their neighborhoods, and even invited other communities. So we started with one community, and we ended up working with 6 because it was like this snowball process. And this snowball process brought a second set of activities, which were these community-led workshops, because people were experiencing a process of urban planning, urban plan development. So what we were asked is to contribute to this more informed participation in this consultation process. So they introduced some of their these new dialogues brought interest in climate adaptation strategies that were brought into policy. And the third thing is that they were interested in being able to monitor and identify these risks with information, like valid information. So in the end, we had this demand at the end of the project about the importance of water management as a key risk. So this is what led to the second project, and I'll leave Maru to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. So building on the findings, we decided to build a project for the impact scheme. So please, the next slide. Thank you. So the project was climate change policies for people, implementing co-developed water governance and security in the Upper Atoyac River Basin in Puebla. This region includes 2 states, and it's about 3 million people living in that basin. So it is quite relevant. So this is how we framed the project. The main aim of the project is to conduct a broad range of stakeholder consultation to co-develop test, and implement indicators to assess policies for improved water security in the Upper Atoyac River Basin. So this is a 2-year project, and what we expect to have as an impact is water security indicators that are based on the community and technical knowledge, and that can then therefore be used to assess and inform policy development and decision making by diverse actors. So as of now, we are working with communities, with NGOs and local and subnational governments to develop these indicators that the people will be able to estimate and to use to test what the impact of the policies, of the behavior of the people have on water security. And this will obviously be very telling as to how to adapt either their own behavior or policies. So the next slide, please. So the objectives are, the first one is to systematize communities' perception of the needs for water security. This is very important because we often have plenty of indicators produced from secondary information that the government produces, and you can see that there might be no problem with water security. But when you ask the people, they have very different perceptions, and that is exactly what we want to do, see what the perceptions are and how they map to the official indicators. The second objective has to do with the impacts of climate change for the region and how the stakeholders experience them. The third one is to determine and estimate the relevant water security indicators, and that is what we're working with other universities in the region, such as UDLA. And then we would like to see what the trajectories are of these indicators in the basin. And we think that the current institutional and bottom-up strategies for water security are very, very important. This is basically governance, how it works, and how it does not work. And that is one of the challenges of the project. Identify how people see it, how institutions see themselves, how other agencies are involved here. The idea finally is to understand risk in the vulnerable communities and the role of mitigation opportunities. A seventh objective is to identify pilot projects to be implemented throughout the project, basically as a result of the participation of all these stakeholders, and including local actors such as CONCITEP, that's the science institution in Puebla. And finally, we will be writing a white paper with all of this, but the basic idea here is the impact it will have on the communities. And from here, I pass the floor to Soledad. Thank you.
Thank you, Maru. I think you can see me, yes? Yes. Can we go to the next slide? Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Yeah, okay, good. Thanks. So thank you both. As you can see, these projects are very much bottom-up, not just based on collaboration, not just between the academics involved. As you can see, we've been involved since the very early stages of these projects in trying to define what the agenda was, how can we develop this in a way that really helps, that has a substantial impact in the region. But our interest is in trying to understand from the bottom up, what are these vulnerabilities and how these vulnerabilities are intensified by the changing of weather events. And these projects, within the context of research and development described by Professor Pelling earlier, are very much intended to co-develop strategies and solutions. So all of these projects have involved pilot ideas, have developed together with those organizations and communities involved in the project from the beginning. And the aim of this is for academia is to facilitate knowledge development, and particularly different forms of knowledge interaction in a way that empowers those directly affected by these events and changing weather events. And we move forward to a more collaborative way of understanding these solutions in place. So the aim of these projects from the beginning is helping vulnerable communities to recover from challenges, and mostly to begin by understanding the impact, the direct impact in their livelihoods of the compound of challenges around conflict, poverty, informality, and climate change. And the objective is to reach the point where we are now with the second project in Puebla, where we create these solutions and collaborations with government institutions which are usually weaker in terms of processes around governance, but also financial capacity. So we feel that these intersectional and complex challenges need to be addressed directly with communities, and the tools and data sets and knowledge needs to come from the relationships and the interactions with communities in a way that empowers them to work in partnerships and in partnership and help them negotiating action with governments and with other stakeholders as well, such as industry, for example, has been really important in the case of Puebla. So we want to innovate, to build resilience, and to change attitudes to help communities to understand the complexity of these challenges. And try to reduce risk and think about the way that these pilot projects and pilot ideas can help long-term action and change. So this is what we feel could contribute to COP26, and we will be developing these ideas possibly through our participation as well in a range of events there. But I think I will leave it there, and I'll go back to Marta. And
thank you. So thank you very much. I'm going to quickly move on to our next speakers. We're running a bit behind. So moving on to Ed Brown, who's going to be talking to us about modern energy cooking services. Over to you, Ed.
Many thanks, Marta. Good afternoon, everybody. Could you move to the next slide, please? You might be thinking, why specifically looking at cooking in this regard? I'm going to talk about, actually, rather than a single project, I'm going to be talking about a very large program that we are currently running for FCDO. And it's around this whole question of trying to address the challenge of the fact that a large proportion of the global population are still cooking with biomass. Why is this an important issue for us? Well, according to the WHO, household air pollution, or HAP, is associated with around 4 million premature deaths every year. So the inefficient use of these kinds of fuels, biomass, charcoal, coal, and also kerosene, leads to a wide range of different health outcomes. This is particularly this particularly affects some groups in society more than others, particularly children. And also, not only does it have these health impacts, but it also has a series of social impacts in terms of the time expended on these activities, the gendered division of labour surrounding them, and so on. Next slide, please. For our purposes here, it's not only these health and social impacts that are important, but also the environmental and climate impacts of this. So on one level, this is to do with the contributions that non-renewable wood fuels that are burned for cooking make to the generation of carbon dioxide. The fact that the majority of the wood that's used in this way is not harvested sustainably. But also it's to do with black carbon and the role that black carbon plays within global warming, which is an increasing area of interest and concern. And the burning of residential solid fuels accounts, in the latest research, for around up to 58% of global black carbon emissions. Next slide, please. So in the run up to COP, why should we be interested in this? Well, first of all, I think it's one of the major development challenges that has a strong connection across to climate issues. 4 billion people globally don't have access to what we term through the programme modern energy cooking services. It's different in different parts of the world, but the problems are most acute in sub-Saharan and South Africa and South Asia. Next slide, please. If you look across the SDGs, then the second part of SDG 7, which is to do with this clean cooking, is the one that's probably has the least chance of being met. It's an issue which is barely keeping up with population growth. It's also received a lack of political prioritization, but also even where improvements have been made with improved biomass stoves, then the difference that it's made has been probably much less than has been claimed for by many of the proponents of these kinds of solutions. So in these circumstances, what are the solutions? How do we actually get the international community to address this as a major issue and to have it put back onto the top of international agendas? Next slide, please. So I'm the lead of a 40 million UK FCDO investment into tackling this issue. It's a 5-year programme, and its aim is to break out of the business of usual cycle of developments in cooking by investigating how we can much more rapidly accelerate a transition from the use of biomass for cooking to genuine clean cooking, i.e. what we're referring to here is with electricity or with gas. What are we doing across the programme? Which is, people have talked a lot about partnership already in what we've heard this afternoon, and this is a massive partnership across over 100 different partners in different areas of this work. It ranges from evidence, research and insights into how we got to where we are, the knowledge that we have to bring to bear to the issue, around where we are in terms of new technologies and the use of different technologies, innovations in business models, looking at the tracking of progress, and also about how we can incorporate modern energy cooking solutions within this context. Overall, what the programme is trying to look for is a changed narrative on what clean cooking actually means. We can move on to the next slide, please. So this has been shown through some of the work that we've been doing across the programme. We're 2 years into the programme now, and 2 of the biggest publications that we've done on this, first of all, was a publication with ESMAP and the World Bank on the current state of access to modern energy cooking services and the range of the circumstances that face such a large portion of the global population. Next slide, please. And one of the novelties that's come through the work that we've been doing has to move away from simply seeing this as a technical issue, when the lack of access to modern energy cooking services as simply being to do with emissions and efficiency of stoves, to look at this in a much broader sense around issues of affordability, issues of availability, issues of safety, and issues of convenience. Next slide, please. One of the areas that we've particularly hit on is cooking with electricity, which is an issue that really until the last couple of years has hardly been looked at all as a potential way of addressing all of the range of interconnected issues which I outlined at the beginning of this. Next slide, please. So how does this programme relate to the various areas of COP focus that this event is looking at? I want to just touch on 3 of these areas. So firstly, there's the whole question of how we safeguard ecosystems, protect natural habitats and keep carbon out of the atmosphere. I've already mentioned the role that cooking using biomass plays within these systems and the existence of other alternative cleaner solutions such as LPG, ethanol, biogas, electricity, solar thermal and so on. Of course, this is not an easy set of issues. We're looking at this in a range of different ways across the programme. And there are complications. So firstly, of course, LPG is actually, although it's a fossil fuel, it makes less contribution to carbon budgets than the alternative of cooking with biomass. But of course, it is in and of itself also a major issue. We also have issues to do with how electricity is generated. If we move on to the next slide, please. The second major area is how cooking with electricity could also relate to the opportunities around cheaper renewables and storage. So this is an issue that we've been looking at, taking a very close and significant look at across the whole programme, about how the uptake of electricity for cooking can actually be of benefit, not only in terms of affecting the carbon balance, but also in terms of making the electricity that's available through off-grid systems, for example, more sustainable, because it increases the amount of use that's conducted. If we could just flick through quite quickly the next 3 slides, please, because I'm aware that I'm running out of time. Firstly, is to put a look at the case that there is for alternative solutions such as e-cooking. In our Cooking with Electricity, we looked at 5 case studies of where the case can be made very strongly, where there is an opportunity to shift towards electricity for cooking. Next slide, please. And then in 2 seconds, move on to the following one. This slide shows that the different circumstances around different types of electricity generation and the different markets that this produces and the possibilities in terms of the price point for electricity. What are the major issues in relation to using electricity for cooking? Firstly, the high upfront costs of the cook stoves, and secondly, the behavioural change involved. The opportunities that come from this, though, are the alternative innovative financing delivery models that come from connecting the case for electrification with the case for clean cooking. And this could be around on-bill financing, electricity price signalling, and so on. The next slide, please. And the third area for the COP focus is not only the renewables and the push for increasing the levels of renewables and the impact on the climate, but also how we might unleash the finance which can make all of this possible. And one of the really interesting issues is here, if you move to the next slide, is that if you look at the situation facing the clean cooking sector, recent figures that are about to be announced in a major international conference next week suggest that whilst the amount of funding available for clean cooking is beginning to grow, it remains well below the estimated annual amount of $4.5 billion that are anticipated to be required to achieve full access. So that's expenditure every year by 2030. If you look at this, if you look at that in the context of what's available for the overall global electrification agenda, if you move to the next slide, please.
And I'm going to have to stop you now.
Okay, I'll move it. So I will bring that to a close, basically to say that looking at this electrification agenda gives you far more access to resources for investment in this agenda than if you're looking precisely at the old traditional ways in which clean cooking was funded by the traditional fuels and so on. Thank you. Apologies for going slightly over.
Right. Thank you very much. So we are running a bit behind on schedule. So what I suggest that we do is that the presenters have a look at the questions on the Q&A and answer them through the chat function rather than me taking those questions now. And as I mentioned earlier, there is still the networking opportunity after the event where the presenters will also be able to ask questions. But I would just like to highlight that there's been a question that has been upvoted by a number of people for you to look at around how we create co-benefits between country-driven climate change policies and development priorities. So do encourage Ed, Maria, Soledad, and Keith to have a look at that and respond to that. Okay, so I'll now move on to the next panel, where we will be hearing about some further projects. And I'd like to invite Robert Nassi to talk about improving how knowledge on forests and trees is understood and used to tackle the climate crisis. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you, Marta, and good evening from Bogor. We're getting a bit late here. I'm going to talk about the Know4 project, which is a project that was, next slide, please. That was DFID funded, fairly large project, about £38 million, and from 2012 to 2017, with 3 very different partners: C4 research organization, IUCN, an international, an intergovernmental organization on conservation of nature, and Prof, a multi-donor trust fund managed by the World Bank. And the basic idea behind Know4 was the fact that a lot of the forest policies or projects or guidelines that are developed are poorly underpinned by science, evidence, and knowledge. And so Know4 tried to address that next. And then NO4 was organized around a theory of change, where we had a series of outputs, which are knowledge product and plan for knowledge uptake. And I will not cover this one, but during the duration of the project, there were more than 1,000 knowledge output produced. A series of outcomes where, in fact, the decision maker were equipped by this knowledge, comparable evidence and tools, so that ultimately they can take decisions that will end up in the impact, and the impact were for poverty reduction, biodiversity conservation, climate stabilization, etc., etc., and especially the impact through change on forestry policies and practices. And I will give you an overview of some of the impact, focusing on the climate change part, because NO4 worked also on different issues like Ebola or other crises. Next. So first case is REDD+ policy in Vietnam, where in fact, thanks to the work and the knowledge product developed by NO4 and the collaboration with the various partners in Vietnam, we had managed to change the payment for forest and environmental service scheme at the national level via developing a comprehensive monitoring and evaluation plan, changing the benefit sharing mechanism, and also looking carefully at the financial administration management. So, and now this PFES is in place and working in Vietnam. Next slide. Remaining in Asia, moving in Indonesia, I mean, a sort of, unfortunately, during the period of NO4 was 2015, which was a very bad year in terms of forest fire in Indonesia. And as a result, we did some work with the local government and with the BAPENAS, which is the national planning agency, help them via NO4 product and contribution and help to develop the grand design for fire prevention, and also to develop some local regulation in the Rio province, which was one of the most affected by this pit fire. Next slide. We had also some serious work in terms of restoration work, and especially restoration using agroforestry system, looking in Brazil and in Peru, and looking both at restoration opportunity in Peru and also guidebooks for restoration of agroforestry in Brazil that is now currently implemented and also tested with some things that are not necessarily common knowledge, but using agroforestry with oil palm, and shows that very interesting results. And the people, the organization have taken this into their practice and doing it now. Next. And then we had also a series of evidence-based forestry review, and the idea was really to see, okay, can we provide, based on systematic review, the evidence-based that will be needed to take some policy decision, like was presented in the classical view by our first panelist. And then we had produced something like 17 of these systematic review and evidence-based. 2 of these EBF were named about the most influential publication of 2016. One of the China's conversion of cropland to forest program, and the other one about gender composition on forest and fishery management. And we have the latest of this EBF that is published this week on the global analysis of the social and environmental community forest. It's more difficult based on that to see what is the impact in terms of policy, but we think that by creating this body of knowledge and systematic evidence, I mean, a sort of, we are providing tools so that decision maker can act and take decision and develop policy related to the common topic. Next. We also have developed some land use decision making tool into NO4, and we have the Borneo and Papua Atlas on deforestation, and these, if you click at the link, these are open access, and you can monitor on almost real-time deforestation and impact of commercial plantation, pulpwood, oil palm, the position of the meal, and in terms of for Papua and for Borneo. And also totally different topic, that's a vegetation map, Africa Tree Finder, which is also an application that will help you if you are sitting in a place in Africa. You use the map, and the map will tell you what is the best set of trees that you can use if you want to do restoration in this place. And these things now are used by people on the ground. Next. Ultimately, I mean, a sort of we had a final evaluation of NO4, and then the project was pretty well ranked, and then it's clear that the focus on design, monitoring, evaluation, and learning, I mean, using a theory of change, using a very user-centered design with stakeholder analysis, knowledge co-production with the decision maker, has very much increased the knowledge uptake, and as a result, we managed to have a pretty good exceeding the target in terms of outcome and impact, and that's where the project ends. Next slide. Where it fits for COP20, I mean, it's clearly 26 is clearly the nature priority, and we are all talking now about nature-based solutions, which are action to protect or sustainably manage or restore natural or modified ecosystem. And we know based on study that they can provide up to 1/3 of the climate change mitigation needed by 2030, and at reasonably lower cost compared to other alternatives, which doesn't mean that we should not reduce emission on other sector, but this one can help and at the same time provide some co-benefits. But policymakers and practitioners need knowledge to help them to make the best decision related to NBS, and this is where an approach like NO4 will be very useful in terms of implementing for the decision making and the various follow-up of the COP26 nature priority decision. And I think it's my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. So I'm going to swiftly move on to our next speaker, Olga Kopika, who's going to be presenting on safeguarding riparian ecosystems and livelihoods safety nets, and in the face of a changing climate change. She's going to give us some insights from a semi-arid savanna in Zimbabwe. So over to you, Olga.
Thank you very much, Marta. Our research aims to showcase what is happening in the southeastern part of the lowveld in Zimbabwe, where we focus on communities living on the edge of protected areas. And these communities basically live in a semi-arid environment, which is hard hit by prolonged drought periods, and agricultural production is virtually nil because they rely mostly on dryland agriculture. So for their livelihoods, these communities mostly rely on natural resources at their disposal, and surface water is also very scarce. Apart from that, groundwater resources are also depleted within the area, so they rely mostly on the riparian zone for their water. Next slide, please. So this is just a brief background in terms of our research project. So basically, the riparian zone is faced with multiple stressors, and considering that the majority of the population in Zimbabwe relies on rivers for their water supply, it is actually imperative that we focus on how these communities can help to protect and still rely on the riparian zone for their ecosystem goods and services which support their livelihood. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so this is just showing part of the extreme events in the southeastern lowveld. Like I've already mentioned, the area is hard hit by severe droughts, and it's actually a semi-arid environment, and projections so that the worst case scenario will happen within the area with low rainfall being experienced in the coming years. Next slide. So in terms of this project, the whole idea is to work together with various stakeholders from government departments, from the university, to try and document local knowledge and also harness strategies which can be used to try and profile impacts on the riparian zone, which are exacerbated by the changing climate, apart from the already existing multiple stressors. Next slide, please. So this is the study area. So basically the area comprises of different land use categories. The river systems, which is Runde and Mwenezi, run across 3 different land use categories, which range from rural communities, protected areas, as well as commercial farming areas, where we have the largest sugar cane planting estate, which is run by the multinational company, which is the Tonga Development. So, but this project mostly focuses on those areas. If you check on the map where it is written Chilonga and Chikombedzi, which are the communities who live on the edge of protected areas. Next slide. So in terms of project activities, in trying to harness this local knowledge from the different stakeholders, a number of activities were done, which included the inception meetings with various stakeholders in the study area, and participatory approaches were eventually used to document the impacts, as well as to try and come up with the profile of the strategies which are used by the local communities, which can be used to protect and safeguard the riparian zone. And on our part as a university, the whole idea is to make sure that we package and document those results, which can possibly be used as part of interventions which can be used by the communities and upscaled as a way of protecting the riparian zone, which is critical for sustaining livelihoods in this era of climate change. Next slide. So these are some of the activities which we have undertaken in the area. And what is mostly interesting is that if you check on one of the slides, it's mostly women. The majority of the participants in this project have been women. So in terms of gender participation in this project, it's actually pronounced, since the majority of the rural communities in this part of Zimbabwe is comprised of mostly women who actually are the household heads, mostly because their male counterparts, most of them migrate across South Africa to also seek work, which can also help to complement and supplement their household income. So we also did activities, field observations along the river systems to try and identify areas and challenges which need to be addressed. Next slide. So in terms of the impact so far, apart from co-production of knowledge, the project also involves capacity building, both on the side of the undergraduate students who are also participating and the postgraduate students who are participating. So there's a lot of knowledge co-generation, there's a lot of dissemination, which is also aimed to make sure that we showcase the research across the different stakeholder categories. Next slide. So in terms of profiling, these are some of the coping strategies. So for this project in particular, we're dwelling more on the positive, what I would call the positive coping strategies, which also help to ensure that there is a sustainable utilization of the ecosystem goods and services within the riparian zone. Remember, I've said in terms of water resources, surface water is limited and also groundwater is depleted. So there's more pressure on the riparian zone to make sure that communities actually rely for their household water use as well as livestock. So this overlap in terms of habitat overlap, in terms of water utilization, results in, it compromises the water quality within the riparian zone, which is also another important area which needs to be addressed. The next slide. So in terms of safeguarding activities, part of the area, this shows what is happening in along the Runde River, where communities are actually involved in dredging of the heavily silted Runde River. Remember, some of the multiple stressors eventually lead to heavy siltation, and this actually limits the amount of groundwater which can actually flow within the river system, and it also compromises the environmental flow requirements of this river system. Next slide. So this also shows part of the activities which project has been involved in terms of training and information dissemination. Basically, the idea is to make sure that eventually the information reaches out to the policymakers at local level and at national level, so that we can safeguard the riparian zone, which is critical in terms of contributing towards keeping carbon out of the atmosphere, especially riparian vegetation, but most importantly, the water, which is also critical for sustaining livelihood. Next slide. So these are some of the proposed safeguarding activities which we have gathered in terms of what communities think would help as intervention strategies which can actually help in terms of making sure that the riparian zone continues to support and livelihoods within the communities. Next slide. So this is my last slide, but I had a small video. I don't know, Marta, do I still have time? Which shows one of the activities where communities
Olga,
are involved in the region.
We're running out of time, Olga. So what I suggest is that you post the link in the chat, and we can also link it to our website together with the booklet and the information about the other presentations. Thank you very much.
It's all right.
Okay,
Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olga. So I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Robert Nichols, who's going to talk to us about the development of coastal Bangladesh under climate change scenarios. So over to you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon. So I want to share with you a project done under the ESPA Deltas project. ESPA was a ecosystem services for poverty alleviation funded by then DFID, NERC and ESRC, and this is a Bangladesh UK cooperation. Next slide, please. And so the study area is coastal Bangladesh. Bangladesh is on a delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra delta coming from the Himalayas, shown in the left panel. And the hatched area has 100 million people living on it in Bangladesh and India. And globally, there are 500 million people living on deltas in low and mid-latitude countries, often poor people. And sort of Bangladesh exemplifies this, often considered the most vulnerable country to climate change on Earth. And our study area was looking in the right-hand side at the pink area, Khulna, Barisal, and includes the Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest. So there's a nature dimension to what we're doing here, and understanding the ecosystem services and how they might evolve into the future. Next slide, please. When we look at Bangladesh and climate change, and particularly sea level rise, this is the kind of image that you find on the web, where we have the top panel today, the bottom panel with sea level rise, and also the fact the delta is sinking, the land is submerged, and in fact the study area I just defined for you is shown as being completely submerged after 1.5 meters of sea level rise and 17 million people displaced. This captures a key threat to Bangladesh, but deltas are rather more complex. Next slide, please. And so when you actually start to look at what's shaping coastal Bangladesh, you recognize there are a number of things going on at global, regional and delta scales, and then interacting with the people living there. There's a population of 14 million people in our study area. Next slide, please. So we have sea level rise and subsidence in here, but we have lots of other things. Next slide, please. And therefore, that includes, for example, 5,000 kilometers of embankments. So this is a very human influenced landscape as well. So we have to take account of all these different things to really understand today and the future and climate change. Next slide, please. So we took a similar systems approach in the project, in that we had over 100 scientists involved, and we had a lot of work on biophysical work. So we looked at climate change going down through to things like agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, and mangroves, which provide the livelihoods for the people. Next slide, please. We also considered a lot of stakeholder engagement. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And we had a lot of work on household surveys. We interviewed 1,500 households 3 times over a season to understand how they use ecosystem services. We looked at population projections, economic analysis, etc. Next slide, please. But how do you really join this all together and make it useful for decision making? And so we focused, this could be done by sort of an expert judgment type process, but we focused, next slide please, on actually bringing this together in an integrated process where we actually developed an integrated assessment model that allowed us to bring together all these different components shown in the diagram. Next slide, please. And so we produced Delta DM, the Delta Dynamic Integrated Emulator Model, which really is designed to make the science we have available at the landscape scale so we can help to inform different decisions. Next slide, please. We did a lot of work with stakeholders. We held stakeholder events over this sort of 4 or 5 year project every 6 months, understanding the issues, etc., moving through. And we also formed a link with the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. This is a joint meeting with them in Dhaka, which was being formulated at the same time. So we also had sort of buy-in from government. Next slide, please. So what are the take-home messages? Well, first of all, we found the future's more sensitive to policy interventions to 2050 than it is to climate change. Next slide, please. But cyclones, cyclones still represent a potential brake on development. So extreme events can still be of concern. Next slide, please. But fortunately, recent events like Cyclone Amphan, which happened this year, do suggest that Bangladesh is getting better at dealing with those events. Next slide, please. So beyond 2050, and next slide, please. Climate change, when we go beyond 2050, is much more of concern. And that's not just sea level rise, it's higher temperatures, it's the changing hydrology and runoff, and it's more intense cyclones. Next slide, please. So strategic adaptation to these challenges is essential, and that needs to start now. So certainly the Bangladesh Delta Plan, which is planning climate resilient development, is absolutely critical. Next slide, please. So take-home messages. Well, I think very importantly, there are plausible adaptation and development interventions that can significantly mitigate climate risks and promote equitable development, and that's quite different to the narrative you often hear. And so therefore there's a lot of power in Bangladesh to influence the future. Our new model certainly helps to support that planning. Next slide, please. And we've actually done demonstration projects as well as doing it for research. We've linked it to things like waterlogging and looking at new polders that are proposed within the Bangladesh Delta Plan 2100. So moving to an operational use. So the scope for further application is large. Next slide, please. Well, there's quite a lot of literature written on this, which you can look at in your own time. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And just to conclude, I'd like to acknowledge the consortium that made this possible, more than 100 people and 21 institutions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Robert, and thank you for keeping to time. So that concludes our second session. I am afraid that we are running a little bit behind time, and so I suggest that we continue to respond to the questions as you have been doing through the chat function. I can see many of the presenters have already done that, and again, there will be that opportunity during the networking session afterwards where the presenters have also kindly made themselves available to answer further questions. So I'm now going to introduce Sarah Blackburn, Ellie Gilvin, and Rosalind West. So we have now the opportunity to hear from the two largest ODA funders, Official Development Assistance, or AID funders, of Research for Climate Change and International Development, UKRI and FCDO. So Sarah Blackburn from NERC, Ellie Gilvin from EPSRC, and Rosalind West from SCDO are joining us to give insight into the next steps for international development research as we prepare for COP26 over the coming year. So over to Sarah and Rosalind and Ellie.
Hi, thanks. I think I'm speaking first on this one. So,
okay, so Ellie first then.
Yeah, that's fine. So just first of all, thank you to Marta, Laura and UKCDR colleagues for allowing us space on the agenda today. I know the team had many times as many great projects to consider to feature this afternoon than the time allows. So it's been fantastic to hear about some of the activities and initiatives that have been leading the way to shape how we can meet the COP26 priorities. So that being acknowledged, we only have a small amount of time today, so I'll move quickly to the next slide, please. And probably the next one as well. But just to briefly introduce myself, I'm Ellie Gilvin, Head of International Development at the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And I'm sharing this presentation with my colleague Sarah Blackburn from the Natural Environment Research Council as well. So we'll be covering some of the key lessons that have been learnt through our work funding international development research collaborations in this area, and then quickly introducing our focus for the future before handing over to Rosalind West from FCDO. So next slide, please. I thought it would be good to just start with a quick introduction to what is UKRI. So I realise that I often speak to people assuming that they know what UKRI is. And for those of us who work there, it's easy to forget that we're still quite a relatively new organisation that's still taking shape following our formation in 2018, and that not everyone is always using the same acronyms as us every day. So the key points are detailed on this slide, but the main thing that I wanted to highlight here is that as a funding agency, we now recognise in our organisational structure the need for collaboration between the scientific disciplines. Our experience in international development funding, including both Newton and Global Challenges research funds, has shown what can be achieved through collaboration, particularly in the scientific community in terms of driving positive global change, particularly with the knowledge policy practice type of collaborations that Mark Pelling described in his introduction, and as we've been hearing in action actually from some of the presentations so far this afternoon. So I'm just going to quickly hand over to Sarah for the next slide, please.
Thanks, Ellie. Hope people can hear me okay. So yeah, we're going to talk a bit about key principles for challenge-led research. So we recognise that climate change and understanding its impacts is an interdisciplinary challenge, as demonstrated by the fantastic talks given today. And if we want to take a holistic approach to understanding systemic climate risk, vulnerability, and how to enhance resilience to those risks, will require truly interdisciplinary research. The UKRI committed to supporting and building capacity for interdisciplinary research excellence, bringing together researchers to assemble new knowledge and generate new insights into development challenges. And we're strategically building on a foundation of previous investments made by UKRI that can be applied into these new development challenges. And successful interdisciplinarity really involves identifying the right mix of disciplines, co-creation of common vision and goals, and identifying a joint approach from the outset. Positive operational and research leadership, and identifying a method for dealing with any disagreements that may arise when you're bringing different perspectives together. So we're encouraging researchers to take new approaches that aren't constrained by traditional methodologies or disciplinary silos, and instead take a challenge-led approach. Next slide, please. So equitable research partnerships and co-design are integral to successful interdisciplinary and international research. And UKRI will look for evidence of equitable partnerships in the research that we fund. So we're looking to maximise the benefits of partnership and mitigate potential risks. We want to see fairness, transparency, mutual responsibility and mutual benefit in the research that we fund. So we'll look for evidence of equity in terms of distribution of responsibilities and workload, visits in both directions, equitable decision-making and management responsibilities and access to facilities, and equitable ownership of the research outputs. And so over the last 5 years or so of really focusing ODA funding streams such as GCRF and Newton Fund, there are some points of sort of best practice that come up time and time again. So it's about setting that joint agenda with mutual agreement around the meaning and the purpose of the work, clarity of roles and responsibilities, recognition of interests and incentives of all partners, building mutual trust and having regular communication, and really investing time in developing the partnership and recognising the importance of face-to-face meetings. Regularly reviewing the health of the partnership and building in an ability to adapt as you go along is important, and developing an agreed dispute resolution process is really helpful to set out at the beginning. Next slide, please. And so research for development really should be needs-based and action-oriented. And so understanding local contexts in which the research will be applied is absolutely key. So it's critical for in-country stakeholders and beneficiaries, whether they're researchers, local citizens, development practitioners, or policymakers, take a leading role in informing research priorities, in the implementation of research outcomes, and in driving research uptake to ensure that there are feasible and effective approaches being developed to address development challenges. And underpinning all of this is the need to build research capacity to do research for development, both here in the UK and in developing countries, and to build capacity for research uptake in country, to enable those research investments to have legacy of impact which endures beyond the funding period. And so building capacity of not just individuals, but also at the institutional and systems levels is an area that UKRI are likely to have greater focus on in the next spending review period. Thanks. I'll pass back to Ellie now. Next slide, please.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so moving on to thinking about the future and our future priorities. Just got a couple of quick slides to outline our thinking on where that's headed. And before we sort of go into more of the detail, one of the documents that I'd like to draw your attention to, if you're not already familiar with it, is the UK government's Research and Development Roadmap, which was published earlier this year. There's a link there if we're circulating slides later as well, if you haven't seen it. But there's a couple of key points that I'd like to pull out, which are particularly relevant to today's discussion. So those are that the roadmap includes a commitment to position the UK at the forefront of international collaboration, and cites the strengths of GCRF and Newton approaches to this to date. But also it reinforces the acknowledgement of the vital role that research and innovation can play in achieving net zero emissions targets, and cites COP26 as a focus for the UK to convene some of this research and innovation momentum for addressing international climate challenges. So next slide, please. So many of you will be aware that we're actually expecting news of the UK spending review later this month, and the outcome of this will determine the scale of our future activities in this area. But I did want to highlight today that one area we've identified as a priority for future activity is to support research and innovation that supports the addressing the climate development challenge. This is obviously a massively complex area that requires input from science, policy and economics across very diverse global contexts, as we've been hearing today. But I think, as today's short talks have shown, we do have the tools to succeed here. Now, when I was putting these slides together the other day, I rediscovered a quote from Cristina Figueres, who's the former head of the UNFCCC, lots of C's, who said that impossible isn't a fact, it's an attitude. And if 2020 has taught us one thing, it's that faced with an imperative, we as the global community have the capacity to change our attitudes and assumptions and to draw on the best of the academic research to help us out and meeting a global challenge. So I think the COP26 Climate Summit next year really will provide us with a great focus for the future, and a platform for research and innovation to catalyse global change. So with that, I will finish and hand over to Rosalind. I think we have some time for questions after this, and both Sarah and I will be attending the networking event directly after, so we can discuss any of this further as well. I think we have a few slides to skip through.
Rosalind, over to you.
Thanks so much, and thanks Ellie and Sarah. Many of the principles that are by the former Commonwealth and Development Office, where I lead our work in the Research and Evidence Division on climate resilience and adaptation. It's been such a pleasure to hear so many fantastic examples of research that's really having impact on climate resilient development in so many different places. And I know that there were hundreds of other submissions to join this webinar today. So thanks all very much for that. So I'm just going to go back to the very beginning where Mark was talking about the COP26 priorities and thinking about how our research is really organised to support those COP26 priorities. So if we look on the next slide, so as you'll know, the UK in partnership is hosting the COP26 in November of next year, and it's got this. This is a very important meeting of parties of the UNFCCC to be on from 5 years on from Paris 6, around decarbonisation of the global economy and around adaptation resilience and these core aims of that meeting. And as part of its presidency, the UK has chosen 5 campaigns to focus on for COP26. So we have adaptation and resilience, the energy transition, nature, zero emission vehicles and finance, and then of course the co-benefits in between those. And Mark highlighted, research has got a critical role to play in informing the COP process. And COP26 is really a turning point for turning the ambition that's been raised in past years into action. And that action, of course, needs to be informed by a robust evidence base in order to be effective and to meet the magnitude and the scale of the challenge presented by climate change in the context of all the other global challenges that we're witnessing. And so I'm just going to move on to the next slide and highlight the research that we, just the areas of the research that we funding in FCDR. I know that we are asked to talk about, the priority. And as Sarah and Ellie have mentioned, of course, with a 1-year spending review, we have to kind of, I'm going to take that as, I'm still going to just focus on what are the broad areas where we expect to be funding research in the future. And these relate quite nicely to those COP themes. And in my team, which focuses on climate, energy and water research, we have 5 broad areas of research that relate to climate change. So we have a huge focus of work on clean energy, a large area of work on safe and secure water, platforms that are working on environments, challenges. Then we have research on weather and climate, driving our climate resilience and adaptation through more effective use of climate and disaster risk science. And in our sister department, the agricultural research team, support a large amount of work on climate resilient food systems. I'm just going to now, I think Ellie and Sarah have really highlighted the principles that define the research that we fund between UKRI and the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, who often work together to co-fund programs that I know many of you are involved. And it'd be nice to take a focus and insight into the programs that we are hoping to be able to fund in the coming years. So on the next slide, a quick focus on the £1 billion Ayrton Fund. Now this was announced, so as you know, the Prime Minister announced a doubling of the UK's international climate finance to at least 11.6 billion from next year and the next 5 years, last year. And one of the 4 priority themes that announcement was unlocking of affordable and clean energy for all. And that will be delivered under this new £1 billion Clean Energy Innovation Fund that's named the Ayrton Fund after the British physicist Hare Ayrton. This fund will help to develop, test and catalyse of clean technologies, business models to support developing countries for UK domestic deployment, such as energy storage, industry and transport, which also can create new export opportunities and technologies that are primarily needed in developing countries, such as off-grid solutions. So it's divided into those 3 kind of key themes on low carbon energy, low carbon societies, and then smart intermediation. And then a project that's been approved recently but not formally announced, so close your ears if you're from the press, is the compatible growth programme, which is aimed at tackling poor decision making that's leading to infrastructure being locked into high carbon pathways, and it aims at to help carbon countries take an into their decision deployment of critical in France. And so look out on that, which we hope will come soon. If we move on to thinking about the next slide, focusing on, actually it's the one after, sorry. This is where we're looking at the climate resilient food systems. So what we're proposing here is a new Gilbert Fund for innovation in resilient food systems. So this project is not approved. It's in development at the moment. And what we know is that, you know, our agriculture and food systems research investments tends to be quite fragmented. It's not very well coordinated, and we don't have consistent reporting results. So those dispersed efforts make it a challenge to deliver the end-to-end innovation and the user-driven, scalable solutions that Sarah was mentioning earlier. And the fund will provide a framework for our investment in resilient food systems. Using existing UK-funded development programmes and opportunities for targeted investments in a portfolio of new and scaled-up platforms across sustainable food production, pathways to scale for those, response systems for global pest threats, affordable healthy diets, and resilience in fragile and conflict-afflicted states. And then we just go on to the next slide. I know I'm really running out of time, but it's important that we also talk about the work that we're funding on adaptation and resilience specifically, and specifically on weather and climate. So as some of the talks today have been funded by the program, you'll see icons. So a lot of those programs are coming to an end now. And what we are proposing to do here, again, this is in the pipeline, what we're proposing to do is to bring together those different types of work that have gone on in our past programs across climate resilience and adaptation and disaster risk science, bring them together into one framework program, which will build resilience, reduce vulnerability to climate change through action-orientated research and capacity strengthening. We're proposing this as a 5+5 year framework program with three kind of core themes. One on research to support risk-informed early action to reduce the humanitarian impacts of weather, climate and natural hazards. A second theme focusing on development in a changing climate. So, you know, how do we really achieve the sustainable development goals under a changing climate? And then the third theme, to increase our understanding of climate risks and natural hazards, and addressing knowledge gaps in the underpinning evidence for climate resilient development overall pathways. And this links through to the final slide that I just wanted to mention today. So taking us back to the COP. This is an initiative that I'm leading. The COP26 is a critical moment for action on adaptation and resilience, and that action needs to be underpinned by research and by evidence. I think we need to seize this opportunity of COP26 to underscore that centrality of research for understanding what works and what doesn't, to ensure that communities are resilient to the effects of climate change. And that can be done through a combination of better risk information, better decision making tools, and crucially, better solutions. And the Adaptation Research Alliance is intended to be a coalition across the adaptation resilience funding and action communities, increase our capacity to do and use research in developing countries to inform and support effective adaptation to climate change, build resilience and deliver tangible solutions. So thank you all very much for the end there.
Thanks very much, Rosalind, Ellie and Sarah. So I'm afraid we are running over time, and apologies to the participants, but I just want to, last couple of minutes, to thank everyone who presented today, and thank to the audience for joining us. Do remember to go and check out the booklet to accompany the event, which is on the UKCDR. The webinar has been recorded, so we will also share this after the meeting. And we've also provided a link to feedback on the event, and we'd be really grateful if you could complete this. We now have the option of joining the 30-minute networking event. The link to join the network is on the chat of this event, and you'll be able to engage further in Q&A with today's presenters as well with the funders, and being able to message both group and individual participants more freely. I hope to see many of you at the next at the stakeholder event, and lastly, just to thank the UKCDR team behind the scenes who have been running this, Laura Scott, Nicole Hexley, Mimosa Murati, and the Wellcome Trust audiovisual team who have been supporting us. Thank you very much.